Welcome back to our channel, where we uncover the darkest and most shocking true crime stories from around the world. Tonight's case is one of cruelty, deception, and a method of body disposal so gruesome it haunted investigators for years. If you enjoy chilling stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Now, let's dive into the story of a small rural town, a brutal murder, and the killer's cruel method. A dismembered body hidden in pig feed. The town of Oak Haven clung stubbornly to the rolling fields of rural America, a small speck of life stitched into the vast patchwork of farmland like a faded thread that time itself had forgotten. To outsiders, it was nothing more than another on the map: corn rising high in the summer heat, soybeans standing in green and ordered rows, pastures scattered with cows that chewed their cud with slow, unbothered patience. But to those who lived there, Oak Haven was everything. It was where they were born, where they worked, where they worshipped, where they would be buried under the same soil their fathers and grandfathers had turned. Life didn't rush here. It ambled, lazy, stubborn, unchanging. The sign at the town limits still read, Oak Haven. Pop 873. The paint peeling, the metal rusting around its bolts. The number hadn't shifted in nearly 30 years. Families stayed, children rarely left, and the few who did rarely came back. Everyone knew everyone, and more importantly, everyone knew everyone's business. Secrets didn't last long in Oak Haven, or so people thought. But like the gnarled oak roots twisting beneath the fields, some things remained buried deep, hidden, waiting for the right storm to drag them back to the surface. Main Street was the spine of the town, a cracked strip of asphalt where sun beat down mercilessly in the summer and where in winter, snow clung stubbornly until April. On one side stood the general store, which doubled as the post office and the only gossip hub that mattered. Beside it was the diner, its windows always fogged with the scent of bacon grease and coffee, the kind of place where men with mud still on their boots argued about crop prices, while their wives traded whispers about whose marriage was faltering. The church loomed at the far end of the street, its steeple a tired, peeling white that still stood tall as the only beacon visible for miles. Oak Haven wore safety like a familiar old coat, frayed, patched, but still comforting. Yet the longer one lived there, the more it became clear that the seams of that coat were stretched thin, and beneath it lay threads of fear, resentment, and desperation that no one wanted to acknowledge. Among the town's fixtures was Arthur Penhaligon, a man as unavoidable as the church steeple, though infinitely less beloved. He carried himself like someone who thought the entire town was his personal chessboard. His suits were perpetually wrinkled, his tie always crooked, as if even fabric refused to obey him. He owned the hardware store, though calling it a business was generous. Dust caked the shelves, nails and hammers sat untouched, and service was grudging at best. Everyone knew the store wasn't where Arthur made his real money. His fortune came from quieter, dirtier dealings. Small loans at suffocating interest, land deals whispered about in back rooms, debts that swallowed entire families. Arthur had a talent for sniffing out desperation, for dangling just enough hope to reel in the struggling, and then tightening the noose when they couldn't pay. His smile never reached his eyes. Cold, calculating, his gaze seemed to assess the worth of everyone he met like livestock at market. Arthur wasn't liked, not by anyone, but tolerance was cheaper than his wrath. To cross him was to risk financial ruin, public humiliation, or worse. People said Arthur knew where every skeleton in Oak Haven was buried. Some swore he'd even put a few of them there. On the other end of the social spectrum was Silas Blackwood. If Arthur embodied greed and control, Silas embodied quiet endurance. A farmer, as his father and his grandfather had been before him, Silas lived on a spread of land just outside town. His farm was a patchwork of barns slouching under years of hard weather, chicken coops patched with wire, hog pens that stank of ammonia and life. He worked the soil with hands gnarled like old oak roots, his back bent but unbroken, his face carved with lines from sun and wind. Silas spoke little, preferring the language of hard work. At the diner, he nursed his black coffee in silence, always listening, rarely offering more than a grunt or nod. His pale blue eyes seemed faded, watery, almost fragile, but when caught in the right light, They held a depth that unsettled, a hint of storms brewing beneath still waters. But Silas was a man unraveling. The years had been cruel. Droughts that withered his corn before harvest, floods that drowned his soybeans, livestock sickness that culled his herds. Feed prices climbed, markets crashed, and the ledger grew redder with each passing season. Neighbors whispered of unpaid bills and foreclosure notices piling on his kitchen table. And always, those debts traced back to Arthur Penhaligon, whose tightening grip on Silas's farm grew like a shadow at dusk. In the quiet of his farmhouse, as the walls seemed to lean closer and the nights stretched longer, something in Silas darkened. Rage had taken roots low, patient, fed by despair and humiliation. Where once his silence had been the armor of a modest man, now it was the smoldering silence of a man pushed too far. Oakhaven's life went on, blind to the storm beneath Silas's skin. Sundays meant church bells and potluck tables groaning under the weight of casseroles and pies, where gossip tasted as sweet as the tea. Weeknights brought porch lights glowing soft in the dark, children chasing fireflies, and the symphony of crickets humming like a lullaby. On the surface, it was peace, but peace in Oakhaven was fragile. Old grudges simmered like embers, debts ate at pride, and secrets festered in the dark corners of barns and basements. The town was a barn painted bright but rotting at the beams. Then came the night of the storm. Rain swept across the land like a living thing, hammering rooftops, turning dirt roads into rivers of mud. Thunder rolled in endless waves, shaking windows, rattling bones. Lightning split the sky, forking down with the fury of a god, illuminating farmhouses and fields in ghostly flashes. Oakhaven huddled indoors, shutters rattling, prayers whispered into the storm. No one ventured out unless forced. This was a night meant for hiding, for clinging to warmth and hoping the tempest passed quickly. And yet, on this night of fury, Arthur Penhaligon disappeared. No one saw him leave his home. No car pulled from his driveway. No footsteps echoed on the slick pavement. The storm screamed too loud. The rain beat too hard. Arthur was simply there one moment and gone the next. The tempest had swallowed him whole, as though the earth itself had opened and dragged him down into its sodden depths. At first, no one noticed. In Oakhaven, a man could vanish for a day or two without raising alarm. But when the storm passed and the sky cleared to a pale, washed-out dawn, Arthur was nowhere to be found. His house sat silent, his store locked, his phone unanswered. By the second day, whispers began. By the third, the town buzzed with questions. And by the end of the week, fear had seeped into the air of Oakhaven, clinging thicker than the smell of manure after rain. For in a place where everyone knew everyone's business, a disappearance was more terrifying than a murder. Murder was visible. Murder left blood, a body, a trail. But disappearance meant the darkness had swallowed a man whole, leaving nothing behind. And in Oakhaven, everyone knew that where there was silence, there were secrets. The storm eventually abated, leaving behind a freshly washed world, the air crisp and clean, the trees glistening with residual moisture. But the tranquility was short-lived. 2 days after the storm, a nervous, elderly woman named Martha Jenkins, Arthur Penhaligon's distant cousin and the closest thing he had to a relative in Oakhaven, made her way to the sheriff's department. She filed a missing persons report. Arthur was a creature of habit, Martha explained, always at his hardware store by 8 a.m., always at the diner for lunch. 2 days of absence was unprecedented, alarming. Sheriff Brody, a burly man with a kind face and a world-weary sigh, took the report. He knew Arthur Penhaligon well enough. Not a man to inspire concern, perhaps, but his disappearance was out of character. Brody dispatched his 2 deputies, a young, eager officer named Miller and the more seasoned, cynical Jones, to start interviewing townspeople. The news of Arthur's disappearance spread through Oakhaven like wildfire, fueling the town's favorite pastime, gossip. Whispers followed the deputies as they moved from house to house, from the diner to the general store. Most people expressed a perfunctory concern, but a few couldn't quite hide a flicker of something else, relief, perhaps, or a grim satisfaction. Arthur Penhaligon had a way of rubbing people the wrong way, of making enemies without even trying. "Good riddance," muttered Old Man Hemlock, polishing a glass behind the diner counter. "He owed me a fortune for that back 40 I sold him. Never paid in full, that snake. He was always looking to squeeze folks." Mrs. Henderson, a sweet-faced woman who ran the general store, added with a shake of her head, "Said he'd raise the rent on my store if I didn't stock his cousin's awful canned peaches." Subtle clues began to emerge, forming a faint, troubling outline. Sheriff Brody learned about Arthur's extensive loan book, a ledger of debts owed by half the town. And among the names, highlighted in red, was Silas Blackwood. Silas, it seemed, owed Arthur a significant sum, a debt that had been growing for months. More than that, several townsfolk recalled a heated argument between Arthur and Silas at the diner just a week before Arthur vanished. "They were yelling, right here by the pie counter," Hemlock recounted, pointing a trembling finger. "Arthur was waving his hands, calling Silas a deadbeat. Silas just stood there, jaw clenched, looking like he wanted to punch him. Never seen Silas that mad." The detectives, Miller and Jones, made their way out to Silas's farm. It was an isolated place, nestled deep within a winding country road, far from the nearest neighbor. The farm itself seemed to embody Silas's quiet, solitary nature. The barns were old, weathered, but well-maintained. A small, sturdy farmhouse stood nearby, its windows dark and uninviting. The air was thick with the earthy smell of livestock and, more prominently, something else, a sweet, vaguely metallic scent, like cooked meat, but different. Behind the largest barn, Miller noticed a massive, cylindrical metal vat, roughly 8 feet high and 6 feet in diameter, sitting over a brick fire pit. A thin wisp of smoke curled lazily from a chimney pipe attached to its side. "What's that, Mr. Blackwood?" Miller asked, gesturing towards the vat. Silas, his face impassive, his hands shoved deep into his overalls pockets, replied, "That's for the pig feed. We boil down all sorts of scraps, vegetables, grain. Makes a nutrient-rich slop for the hogs. Keeps them healthy, helps them grow." He spoke with a practiced ease, almost as if he'd rehearsed the explanation. Jones, the more experienced detective, eyed the vat with a flicker of unease. It was unusually large even for a pig farm, and the fire pit beneath it looked like it could churn out an immense amount of heat. Then came the first truly chilling hint. Mrs. Gable, Silas's closest neighbor, who lived almost a mile down the road, called the sheriff's department a few days later. She was a timid woman, reluctant to get involved, but something had been bothering her. "I know it sounds crazy, Sheriff," she stammered over the phone, "but on that night Arthur disappeared, the stormy one, I couldn't sleep with all the thunder, and I kept smelling this awful smell, like burnt flesh almost, and there was so much smoke coming from Silas's place, even with all the rain. It was odd, Sheriff. Really odd." Sheriff Brody listened, a knot forming in his stomach. Burnt flesh, boiling vats, Arthur Penhaligon and his extensive list of enemies. The quiet town of Oakhaven was beginning to feel far less quiet and far more sinister. Sheriff Brody couldn't shake Mrs. Gable's call. The smell of burnt flesh and the unusual smoke from Silas's farm on the night Arthur Penhaligon vanished gnawed at him. It was a thread, thin but persistent, in the fabric of the investigation. He assigned deputies Miller and Jones to dig deeper into Silas Blackwood's activities. They started with surveillance. For 2 days, from the pre-dawn mist to the lingering twilight, Miller and Jones positioned themselves at various discrete points around the perimeter of Silas's farm. They observed. Silas kept to his routine, feeding his pigs, tending to his fields. He rarely left the property, and when he did, it was usually for supplies at the feed store in the next town over, avoiding Oakhaven. His alibi for the night of the storm, a vague claim of being asleep, began to fray under the scrutiny. No one could corroborate it, and his solitary existence made it almost impossible to verify. During their surveillance, the deputies noticed something else. the massive boiling vat behind the barn. While it was used for pig feed, as Silas claimed, it seemed to be in use almost constantly, far more often than typical for a farm of its size. And occasionally, on the chill evening air, they caught that faint, sweet, sickly odor Mrs. Gable had described. It was subtle, almost masked by the usual farm smells, but unmistakably present. Sheriff Brody, armed with the mounting inconsistencies in Silas's alibi, the neighbor's testimony, and the unusual activity around the pig feed vat, decided it was enough for a search warrant. The judge, a stoic man who had known Silas's family for generations, granted it with a heavy heart. Early one crisp morning, a convoy of sheriff's department vehicles, led by Brody, pulled up the long gravel driveway to Silas Blackwood's farm. Silas, emerging from his farmhouse, saw them coming. His face, usually impassive, tightened almost imperceptibly. He said nothing as Brody presented the warrant, merely gestured with a silent hand towards his property. The search began methodically. Miller and Jones, along with several state police forensic technicians, fanned out. The farmhouse was meticulously examined, then the barns. Inside the main barn, where the pigs were kept, the air was thick with the smell of swine. But underneath it, a fainter, more metallic odor lingered, something vaguely like blood. Using luminol, a chemical spray that reacts to the presence of blood, the forensic team made their first unsettling discovery. Dark, almost invisible stains on the concrete floor, near a drain, glowed a stark, eerie blue under the ultraviolet light. It wasn't a massive pool, but a telltale splatter pattern, as if something had been dragged, then rinsed. Then they moved to the boiling vat. This was the centerpiece of their suspicion. Two forensic technicians wearing hazmat suits carefully approached it. The vat was still warm, emitting a faint steam. One technician, a young woman named Dr. Anya Sharma, used a long, sterilized scoop to draw a sample from the thick, viscous contents within. It was a murky, grayish-brown slop, thick with organic matter. As Dr. Sharma brought the scoop closer, a collective gasp went through the assembled officers. Floating amidst the cooked vegetables and grains, unmistakable even to the untrained eye, were fragments. Small, irregular pieces of bone. Some were no bigger than a thumbnail, others slightly larger, distinctly curved. And then, a tiny, almost translucent sliver of what looked disturbingly like human tissue. "Get this to the lab immediately," Sheriff Brody barked, his voice tight with controlled horror. He felt a wave of nausea, a cold dread washing over him. This was far worse than he had imagined. Hours later, the preliminary forensic report came back. The bone fragments were unequivocally human. The tissue sample was also human. And further analysis revealed trace amounts of blood in the slop that matched DNA taken from Arthur Penhaligon's toothbrush, which had been found in his bathroom. The horrifying truth descended upon Oakhaven like a shroud. Arthur Penhaligon wasn't just missing. He had been dismembered, cooked, and fed to pigs. The quiet farmer, Silas Blackwood, was no longer just a man with financial struggles and hidden rage. He was a monster. The emotional reactions from the townspeople were visceral. Fear, a raw, primal terror, replaced the familiar comfort of their quiet lives. Disbelief warred with a sickening sense of betrayal. The man who lived among them, who shared their roads and their sky, had committed an act so depraved, so utterly unthinkable, that it shattered their perception of reality. Neighbors eyed each other nervously, wondering if they had ever truly known anyone. The familiar scent of Oakhaven, of earth and manure, now carried a faint, horrifying undertone of something else, something unspeakable. The town was forever marked, its innocence irrevocably lost to the chilling discovery at Silas Blackwood's pig farm. The trial of Silas Blackwood gripped Oakhaven and the surrounding counties in a morbid fascination. The small, unassuming courthouse, usually a quiet hub for minor disputes and traffic violations, became the epicenter of a macabre spectacle. News vans from distant cities lined the streets, reporters buzzed with a hunger for every gruesome detail, and the courtroom itself was packed to capacity each day. A sea of somber faces, eager to witness justice, or perhaps simply to comprehend the incomprehensible. The prosecution, led by the stern and meticulous District Attorney Helen Vance, painted Silas Blackwood as a cold-blooded murderer, a man driven by desperation and a simmering resentment. Vance's opening statement was a calculated assault, laying bare the horrifying narrative. "The defendant, Silas Blackwood," she declared, her voice resonating with authority, "did not merely kill Arthur Penhaligon. He systematically desecrated his remains, reducing him to mere sustenance for his livestock. This was not a crime of passion, ladies and gentlemen. This was an act of calculated, premeditated brutality, designed to erase all traces of his victim, to literally feed him to the pigs." The defense, marshaled by a weary but determined public defender named David Evans, argued strenuously against the prosecution's narrative. Evans admitted the presence of human remains on the farm, a fact impossible to deny, but he asserted that the evidence was entirely circumstantial. "The prosecution has presented a gruesome scenario," Evans conceded, "but they have failed to provide a single eyewitness to the murder. They have failed to place my client at the scene of the alleged killing. The remains, while tragic, could have been planted." Mr. Blackwood's farm, sadly, became a convenient dumping ground for a crime he did not commit. He tried to paint Silas as a simple farmer, overwhelmed by financial woes, an easy target for a vengeful or clever killer. Witness testimonies unspooled the grim tapestry of the case. Neighbors, including Mrs. Gable, recounted the strange smells and smoke from the farm on the night of the storm. Mr. Hemlock, from the diner, vividly described the heated argument between Silas and Arthur, detailing Silas's barely contained fury. Even the local butcher, who regularly sold Silas large quantities of pig feed supplements, testified about Silas's unusual inquiries into specific chemical compounds that accelerated decomposition. Perhaps the most damaging testimony came from Arthur Penhaligon's ex-wife, a tearful woman who spoke of Arthur's ruthless business practices and the many enemies he had made. But she also, under cross-examination, admitted that Arthur had been particularly aggressive with Silas about his mounting debt, threatening to foreclose on the farm that had been in the Blackwood family for generations. Then came the chilling details that truly horrified the jury and the public. Dr. Sharma, the forensic anthropologist, presented her findings with clinical detachment, yet her words painted a vivid, sickening picture. She described the analysis of the bone fragments, the precise cuts and fractures consistent with dismemberment. She detailed the chemical residue found in the pig feed vat, indicating the use of accelerants to hasten the breakdown of organic matter. She even brought up search history found on Silas's old, clunky computer, queries about body decomposition in pig slop, effective methods for disposal of large organic matter, and rendering animal carcasses. The sheer premeditation, the cold, calculating research, sent shivers through the courtroom. Photographs of the evidence were projected onto a large screen, the glowing luminol stains on the barn floor, the industrial-sized vat, and finally, the most horrifying images. Close-ups of the bone fragments, unmistakable as human remains, meticulously catalogued and identified. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Some jurors visibly recoiled, others struggled to maintain their composure. The reality of what had happened, once an abstract horror, was now tangible, undeniable. The tension in the courtroom became almost unbearable as the trial neared its conclusion. The final arguments were delivered, each side summarizing their case, hammering home their narratives. The jury, a diverse group of Oak Haven residents and people from neighboring towns, listened with grave expressions, their faces revealing nothing. They had heard the whispers, the theories, the horrifying facts. Now they were tasked with deciding the fate of Silas Blackwood, and in doing so, perhaps, bringing a semblance of closure to a town shattered by unspeakable evil. The weight of their decision hung heavy in the air, a silent, almost palpable dread. The silence that followed the jury's return was profound, broken only by the nervous shuffling of feet and the muted clicks of camera shutters. All eyes were on the foreman, a stoic farmer from a neighboring county, as he handed the verdict slip to the bailiff. The clerk read the words that would forever define Silas Blackwood's life, and forever mark Oak Haven. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Silas Blackwood, guilty of the murder of Arthur Penhaligon. A collective gasp, quickly stifled, rippled through the courtroom. A few muffled sobs could be heard from Arthur's distant relatives. Silas Blackwood, his face a mask of stone throughout the trial, remained expressionless, his pale blue eyes fixed on some distant point. He showed no emotion, no remorse, no surprise. It was as if he had already accepted his fate long ago. Perhaps on that stormy night he had silenced Arthur Penhaligon forever. The judge, his voice heavy with the gravity of the moment, delivered the sentence. Life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Silas Blackwood was led away, his footsteps echoing in the suddenly emptying courtroom, a convicted murderer, forever removed from the quiet farmlands he had once called home. The town of Oakhaven, however, struggled to recover. The verdict brought a semblance of justice, but it did little to erase the trauma, the deep, festering wound left by Silas's monstrous act. The innocence that had once characterized Oakhaven was gone, replaced by a pervasive sense of unease. The once friendly gossip now often turned to the horror, whispered in hushed tones over coffee cups at the diner. Every creak of a floorboard, every distant silhouette, every unfamiliar car driving through Main Street seemed to carry a hint of the lurking darkness. The pig farm, once a familiar landmark, became a symbol of unspeakable evil, a haunted place that everyone avoided. Arthur Penhaligon's family, his estranged children who lived far away, attended the sentencing. They mourned the loss of a father, imperfect though he was, and sought closure in the legal proceedings. But the brutal nature of his death, the indignity of his final resting place, made true peace a distant prospect. They collected his meager belongings from his neglected house, sold the hardware store, and quickly left Oakhaven, eager to escape the suffocating shadow of its tragedy. Silas Blackwood's pig farm, the scene of such profound horror, became a desolate monument to the town's lost innocence. The pigs were eventually sold off, the fields lay fallow, overgrown with weeds. The farmhouse stood empty, its windows dark, like vacant eyes staring out at the blighted landscape. The large, metal boiling vat, thoroughly scoured by forensic teams, remained, rusting slowly under the elements, a silent, chilling sentinel. Locals whispered that the farm was cursed, that the very earth itself was tainted by the evil that had transpired there. No one dared to buy it, no one wanted to live on land that had absorbed such suffering. It was left to rot, a permanent scar on the face of Oakhaven. Years passed, but the memory of Arthur Penhaligon and Silas Blackwood did not fade. The story was told and retold, each recounting adding another layer to the town's grim mythology. Children growing up in Oakhaven learned of the quiet farmer and the businessman, and the horrifying secret hidden in the pig slop. It became a cautionary tale, a dark legend that lingered in the periphery of their lives. And so, Oakhaven, the quiet, unassuming town, lived on, forever marked. Its tranquil facade had been ripped away, revealing the unsettling truth that evil often hides in plain sight, behind the most ordinary of smiles, in the most quiet of places. The rustling cornfields and the whispering winds carried not just the promise of harvest, but also the chilling echo of a time when the iron vat and the hungry oink became the instruments of a killer's cruel method, a brutal requiem for a town that would never truly be quiet again.